When a war veteran decides to raise the American flag in his own backyard, he doesn't realize that his biggest battle won't be on the field of war, but against the HOA and its insufferable president, Karen. With abusive fines and threats of eviction, Karen thinks she can bend a national hero, but she didn't know that he has powerful friends in the government. The tables have turned, and now it's Karen who will need a miracle to escape the biggest embarrassment of her life. Do you want to know how this war ended? Stay until the end, because this story only gets better. Veteran James Carter has always been a man of principle. After serving his country for more than 30 years, he just wanted some peace and quiet in his retirement. He bought a house in a quiet community, the kind that seemed ideal for spending his days watering the garden, reading the newspaper, and drinking coffee on the porch. But what he didn't know was that within that seemingly perfect neighborhood, there was a tyrant in the guise of HOA president, Karen. Karen wasn't just any annoying neighbor. She was the kind of person who made the HOA her personal empire. If a bush was 2 inches higher than allowed, she would issue a fine. If a car was parked on the street for more than 2 hours, she called the tow truck. And, of course, any change to the aesthetics of the neighborhood had to be approved by her. He was the kind of person who used the HOA bylaws as if they were the constitution of an entire country. James was not a man of confusion. He'd seen it all in his life: battlefields, risky missions, military politics, and a simple neighborhood association didn't seem like something he needed to fear. But that changed the day he decided to install a flagpole in his backyard. For James, the American flag wasn't just a piece of cloth. It was a symbol of everything he had fought to protect. He had spent years in the service, lost friends, seen things that no one should see. Raising the flag in his backyard was a small gesture to honor his journey. That same afternoon, he concreted the base, raised the flagpole, and hoisted the flag to the sound of the national anthem, as he always did in the barracks. For him, it was an act of respect, but for Karen, it was a direct affront to the order of the community. The next day, James found an envelope taped to the front door, a $500 fine for violating HOA rules. He frowned, opened the letter, and it read, "Exterior decoration not approved by HOA. Remove immediately or further penalty will apply." James laughed to himself. Decoration? Since when was the flag of one's own country decoration? He threw the letter on the counter and went about his day as if nothing had happened. But Karen wasn't going to let it go. 2 days later, another letter. Now the fine was $1,000. At the end of the notice, there was a clear threat. Failure to comply may result in legal action. Now James was angry. He knew very well what kind of people Karen was. People who had never tasted real sacrifice, but loved to dictate rules to those who had actually done something for the country. He decided to ignore it once again. It was then that Karen upped the ante. When James woke up the next morning and opened the door, he saw a team of workers already inside his yard, dismantling the flagpole, without asking permission, without warning. Karen was standing next to them, arms folded, and a smile of victory on her face. "This is private property," James said, marching towards the workers. "It's in the bylaws, Mr. Carter. The HOA has the right to correct infractions." James wasn't a man who got carried away easily, but that was too far. He made the workers stop on the spot, threatened to call the police, and contacted a lawyer. But Karen already had a plan. The following week, James received a notice saying that his house was at risk of foreclosure because of the fines he had accumulated. The penalties now amounted to $5,000, and if he didn't remove the flag and pay up, the HOA could take legal action to seize his home. Now it was no longer a matter of pride. It was war. But what Karen didn't know was that James wasn't just any old retiree. He had connections, and not just any connections. He knew generals, senators, and even a former president. And if she thought he was going to take this crap quietly, she was about to make the worst mistake of her life. James Carter never liked bureaucracy. During his years in the military, He had dealt with enough paperwork to last a lifetime, but now he had no choice. If he wanted to keep his house and prove his point, he would have to fight with the same weapons as Karen, the law. The first thing he did was call an old friend, Senator Robert Whitmore. They had served together many years ago, and now Whitmore held a high position in the government. As soon as James explained the situation, the senator remained silent for a few seconds, and then laughed. "She has no idea how much trouble she's in." James knew that Whitmore had influence, but he had no idea how much. In less than 24 hours, a team of lawyers contacted him to analyze the case. They confirmed that the HOA had no right to prevent anyone from raising the national flag, regardless of the community's internal rules. What's more, threatening to foreclose on the house because of abusive fines was extortion disguised as regulation. Meanwhile, Karen continued to act as if she had already won. In her mind, it was only a matter of time before James gave up. She had used this tactic before, pressuring someone with fines until they simply gave in. But what she didn't know was that James was no ordinary civilian. He wasn't going to bow down to half a dozen absurd forms and rules from a neighborhood association. Over the next few days, Karen continued her crusade against James. Now, the HOA began sending letters to other residents, saying that if they allowed James's flag, the community would soon be overtaken by chaos. She claimed that rules were rules, and that making exceptions would endanger the neighborhood. Some neighbors sided with James. Others, afraid of retaliation, decided to stay out of it. But James didn't need them. He had already triggered something much bigger. The following week, the HOA received a formal notice. It wasn't just from James or some lawyer. It was a subpoena from Senator Whitmore's own office. The document demanded an immediate explanation for the abusive fines and the illegal attempt to seize private property. The blow was direct. Karen received the notice in hand and, for the first time, lost her arrogant posture. But things had only just begun. 2 days later, the scandal hit the national media. A war veteran was being fined and threatened with eviction for raising the American flag. It was the kind of headline that made politicians break out in a cold sweat. The entire HOA went into crisis mode because now they weren't just taking on James. They were up against the government and public opinion. Karen's phone kept ringing. Reporters started showing up on her doorstep. Social media exploded with posts calling the HOA anti-American, dictatorial, and a disgrace to the country. But the worst was yet to come. One of James's lawyers discovered something very interesting. Karen was embezzling money from the HOA. The fines she imposed were being converted into funds that didn't appear in the association's official accounts. So, what now? Now James wasn't just fighting for the right to raise his flag. He was about to destroy Karen completely. Karen thought everything was under control. After all, that's how it always worked. She fined, she pressured, she made the residents bend to her will, and no one dared defy her. But now, things had gone completely out of her control. The media continued to cover the story of the veteran being harassed by an overbearing HOA, and reporters no longer left the neighborhood. Every step Karen took was scrutinized, and public opinion was overwhelmingly against her. Social media was filled with angry comments, people demanding justice, opportunistic politicians speaking out in favor of James. Even the governor of the state made an official statement saying that this was an affront to American values. Meanwhile, the investigation into the HOA's finances only got worse. What began as a simple analysis by James's lawyers quickly escalated into a forced audit by the state government. The numbers simply didn't add up. Fines that should have been used for community maintenance were disappearing, and records indicated suspicious financial movements directly linked to Karen and some HOA board members. Things got ugly. One morning, Karen opened the door and found 2 federal agents waiting for her. The HOA was now under formal investigation for financial fraud, misuse of community funds, and possible illicit enrichment. Karen tried to argue her case, but at this point, there was no point. The investigation already had enough evidence to show that she was up to her neck in irregularities. But the real humiliation came the next day. In the middle of the afternoon, a group of angry residents gathered in front of Karen's house. They were holding placards, demanding her immediate resignation. Until then, the HOA had always operated on fear, with Karen using the rules as a weapon to maintain control. But now the residents realized that they no longer needed to fear her. They demanded an emergency meeting to remove her as president. And it wasn't a request. It was an ultimatum. Karen tried to argue, to shout, to say that this was a coup against her, but no one else was listening. Her reign of terror was crumbling before her very eyes. And James? He just sat on the balcony, sipping his coffee and watching. She had tried to destroy a war veteran for raising a flag. Now she was the one being hunted. Karen had always believed that she had absolute power over the community. For years, she ruled the HOA with an iron fist, imposing absurd fines and intimidating anyone who dared defy her. But now, all that false sense of control was evaporating. Federal agents were investigating the HOA's finances, and every day, new irregularities appeared. Unrecorded fines, overpriced fees, suspicious contracts with companies no one knew about. Everything pointed to a massive corruption scheme that Karen had tried to hide for years, and it didn't stop there. The journalists covering James's case began to dig even deeper. They discovered that Karen was not only embezzling money from the HOA, but also using the funds for personal gain. She had hired a landscaping company to exclusively take care of her yard using residents' money. She paid personal bills with the money from the fines she created herself. Even the renovations to her house were done with the community's money. When this information came to light, it was total chaos. The residents, who had previously been afraid to confront her, were now furious. They demanded that she be expelled from the HOA immediately. But that wasn't all. They wanted all the embezzled money returned. Meanwhile, James watched everything unfold with an almost comical calm. He knew this war was won before it had even begun, but the final blow was yet to come. Senator Whitmore, a longtime friend of James, made a public statement condemning the HOA and demanding swift action from the authorities. He used his influence to pressure the mayor's office and the state government to file a lawsuit against Karen for fraud and abuse of power. By now, Karen was surrounded. The federal agents began interrogating the other members of the HOA board, and one of them soon gave up everything to save his own skin. Afraid of being accused of being accomplices, they exposed every detail of the corruption scheme. The investigation proved that Karen had moved more than $200,000 illegally over the years. This meant that now she was no longer just dealing with fines and scandals. Now she was facing years in prison. James knew it was only a matter of time before the inevitable happened. He just went back to his balcony, took another sip of coffee, and waited for the final show. Karen had tried to destroy a war veteran. Now it was she who was about to be destroyed. The neighborhood was unrecognizable. Before, the residents avoided looking Karen in the eye, lowered their heads, and obeyed her rules without question. Now it was different. She had become public enemy number one. Complaints against the HOA exploded. Residents began reviewing their payment histories and realized that almost everyone had fallen victim to Karen's fake fines scheme. Some families even paid thousands of dollars in unjustified fees. Others realized that their contributions to community improvements had never really been used. Now, it was no longer just James who wanted justice. It was the whole community. In response to public pressure, the mayor ordered a full audit of the HOA. The investigations were just beginning, but the first reports were already devastating. Documents showed direct embezzlements to Karen's personal accounts, overpriced contracts and forged invoices to justify fictitious expenses. The hole was even deeper than anyone imagined. The HOA, which had once seemed like an unquestionable entity, was now in total collapse. Meanwhile, Karen was trying to keep her cool. Always arrogant, she still believed she could get out of this. But the pressure was mounting every day. HOA meetings turned into real public tribunals. At each meeting, more residents showed up to demand explanations. They shouted, pointed fingers, showed evidence of the theft, and wouldn't let Karen speak without being interrupted. Even the HOA board members began to abandon ship. No one wanted to sink with her. But the worst was yet to come. James knew that Karen's final downfall was only a matter of time. But when he saw the federal agents returning to the neighborhood, he knew the moment had arrived. That morning, a convoy of black cars with dark windows parked in front of Karen's house. The neighbors came out to watch, cell phones in hand, ready to film what would happen. Karen opened the door, trying to feign surprise, but her face already showed that she knew what was about to happen. The officers were straightforward. She was being arrested for financial fraud, embezzlement, and abuse of power. The silence lasted only a few seconds. As soon as the officers handcuffed Karen, the neighborhood erupted in applause. Residents celebrated as if it were a national holiday. Some people shouted "justice," while others just laughed and filmed the scene. James watched it all in the same way as always, sitting on his balcony, sipping his coffee, and nodding his head in satisfaction. Karen was put into the police car, and, as the doors closed, her gaze met James's. For the first time, she realized that she had lost. He raised his coffee cup in a gesture of farewell. The war was won, but what no one knew yet was what James had planned next. And if you liked this video, don't forget to subscribe and like it.